On September 17th of this year, Dr. Rena M. Conti gave testimony to the U.S. Senate Finance Committee, where she said there is currently no evidence of a systemic decrease in the percentage of venture capital flowing to pharmaceutical companies after the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. I'm Dwayne Schultes, and on this Vital Health podcast, I'm speaking with John Stanford. He's the Executive Director of Incubate. That's a Washington-based coalition of life science venture capitalists and their life science investment tracker, which presents a far different picture than that presented by Professor Conti. John, it's great to meet you, sir. How are you doing?
Doing well. It's a changing time in the United States and around the world. We sometimes forget as Americans that there are a host of other elections going on. Another life science capital. We've got our eye on Japan. So lots of things going on, and thrilled we could take some time to catch up with you today about what's happening in life science venture capital.
Well, thank you very much, John. Now, why don't you tell me a little bit, just to get started here, about the history of Incubate? What is it, and how do you work with venture capitalists?
Absolutely. My background's entirely in entrepreneurship and company formation policy. So I've tried to answer the question of what can government and the United States do better to get more people growing breakthrough technologies here at home. And about 7 years ago, a number of venture capitalists raised the issue to me that they really lacked a voice in Washington. And there was so much focus. These were the HR3 days of drug pricing reforms. And you have the large manufacturers with their seat at the table through their trade association. You had smaller biotechs coming up through bio. But the investor community really didn't have a voice. And Incubate was created from the ground up with leading venture capitalists lending their name and their reputations. And we've really grown into being the leading voice in Washington for those who are choosing to invest in the wild and risky world of life sciences and new medicines.
It's really interesting you bring up HR3 because my firm, Vital Transformation, we were very involved in that. I think people don't realize that it came down to literally one vote.
Oh, yeah.
Before HR3 was put to pasture, as it were. What was always fascinating about HR3 was the huge impact that it would have had on the venture capital community. Hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars lost to revenues and investment capital to the sector as a whole. Do you think that was a huge wake-up call for your members? Did that really invigorate them to say, wow, we need to do something here?
It absolutely was. And for so many years, I'll be quite honest, venture capital in the life sciences could hide out in the shadows and let pharma and bio and the companies fight the big fights. But that's just not the real world anymore of modern politics and policymaking. And so it became incumbent not just to speak out, but in speaking out, educate, because so few members of Congress understood that at the time, we had to educate almost every member of Congress that what comes out of the NIH is not a medicine. It's not a drug. And in fact, one of our VCs would say very publicly, if you took something that came out of the NIH, it would kill you. It is basic research, and it's the incredible early stage entrepreneurial ecosystem that turns basic research into a product that someday may go into you or me or a loved one and save lives. And so we had to do whole scale education of, well, what is a venture capitalist? It's funny, I had a piece run just before the election. The candidate for vice president came out sort of saying against Mr. Vance, well, what even is a venture capitalist? So it's clear we still have some work to do explaining that venture capital is very American, very entrepreneurial, and the lifeblood of our early stage innovation ecosystem.
Now, picking up on that, it was pointed out to me by Virginia Acha from Merck, one of our clients. She said, hey, you got to look at this investment life science tracker that's being done by Incubate. And I'm just curious, what exactly is this life science tracker? What are you doing with it?
Well, I've got to say these observers, and some are academics, some are policymakers, the idea that we would subtract hundreds of billions of dollars from any industry and not have an impact up and down the value chain is preposterous. But we knew, because of the complexity and the timeline of drug development, we knew there would be so many proponents of some of these drug pricing provisions, pushing out, well, there's no impact. Or the company's CEO on an earnings call said they'll be okay once they got their price control. We knew this was coming. And we said, well, what if we set out to actually measure what's happening in the real world and not leave it to sort of naysayers to tell us the data? And the Life Science Tracker was born. And what it does is we monitor very closely earnings calls, submissions to the SEC, other required documents, both from private and public companies, about the state of the company. And we scan it to see, is the Inflation Reduction Act having an impact? And if it's having an impact, can we quantify it? And can we even go one step further to say, are there types of patients who are losing out specifically? We were very grateful to some of the vital transformation work during the debate of the Inflation Reduction Act. I mean, I think you called out a much higher number of lost medicines. We stand in agreement, and we almost see ourselves validating the number of people, yourself included, who said you're going to lose a lot more than a couple drugs. And I think we pushed back on CBO, but we knew we had to do this in with a methodology that could capture some very intimate details about companies. And the reality is, with all respect to Dr. Conti, she is just wrong. Yeah. The impacts are substantial and real, and I look forward to unpacking them with you.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the earnings call where the CEO, and I think we know which CEO it was, who had said, yeah, we see no impact on IRA in our portfolio. What was really interesting is that morning, there was another call with the oncology portfolio that was written about in endpoints, literally that same day. And they said, yeah, well, we're changing to 90% large molecules. So within a 24-hour period, you had two divisions of the same company making completely contradictory comments about the impacts of IRA on their own portfolio.
And to be fair to the CEOs, you also just see that their quotes get truncated. And I think it's really important on something like this. When the prices came out for the new price control regime for those 10 drugs, this was telegraphed for a long time. The companies had a lot of time to prepare. Many of these were at the end of their life cycle. And if you look at the quotes from many of the CEOs, when they say it's manageable became the word of the day for pharmaceutical CEOs. One product is manageable. But if you read the whole quotes or the whole earning calls or the next quarterly report, they say, look, this is manageable for one drug, but if you apply it to our whole portfolio, it's catastrophic. And it does lead to us making decisions. And this is what we've tried to say. We are not saying that in any way the innovation ecosystem is perfect. And we do need to do things around access and affordability. What Incubate is trying to do with the Life Science Tracker is level the talking point playing field. And let's just be honest about the trade-offs. If you are okay with the medicines we have on the table today, then price controlling medicines makes a lot of sense. But if you believe rare disease patients, more oncology patients, more patients out there need more breakthroughs, then you cannot ignore the economic consequences of taking revenues out of a system. And I feel like the talking points really took over, and we need to get back to basic economic rationale that, yeah, there are going to be consequences, and they're going to be devastating for certain patient communities. Look at the ovarian cancer community. Look at those suffering from a rare blindness disease that Alnylam had to walk away from a phase 3 trial. Who walks away from positive data in a phase 3 trial? Nobody, except if you insert this kind of incentive that says it makes no economic sense for you to move forward. And we just want to have an honest debate so we can move forward.
What the Life Science Tracker does is it tangibly goes in, as you mentioned earlier, and finds those impacts buried in the 10K, in the 10Q annual corporate reports, the quarterly reports. It looks at the press releases and it says, okay, here's what's actually happening. Here's what this company says. And then you actually have all the links. You have all the, basically you come with the receipts. So can you just highlight what you're actually seeing right now since the passage of IRA?
Absolutely. And I actually brought it up on the screen. So for anyone who wants to visit it, www.lifesciencetracker.com, lifesciencetracker.com, and you'll see the top lines. 36 research programs discontinued, 21 specific drugs discontinued since the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. We also look at things, biologics. We said there was going to be a shift in investment away from small molecules. We can quantify it to the tune of $8 billion. Fitch Ratings Agency, not someone who's in the pocket of large pharma, explicitly called out that investing in small molecule companies would be a headwind on returns because of the Inflation Reduction Act. And so you get at the top of the page some of those big top headlines, and then you can really go in and in chronological order, you can also search by disease area. You can look at, okay, what are those 21 drugs and those 36? They're potential cures or treatments for leukemia, bladder cancer, multiple myeloma, hepatitis B, other cancers and rare diseases. You can go through and look at them. We're in the process of also updating it to allow rare disease patient advocates to really hone in on what's lost there. We can go into further and further detail, but if you suffer from any of those diseases, it's hard not to see the hope of patients broken if your cancer treatment isn't there yet, or you're one of the people for whom an existing cancer treatment's not working. And this is why we've done so much with the oncology patient community to get the word out about the science tracker. And they have been great partners because they do believe in the promise of small molecule medicines. And so the tracker, like you said, our goal was to bring the receipts. This isn't in the macro. This isn't the sky is falling, innovation is ending. It's innovation is continuing, but it's looking different. And for some people, it's going to look drastically different. And that gives us a lot of pause.
I think that's one of the real problems of the Inflation Reduction Act. It actually penalizes the people to whom it was sold as being a solution. And that is, it was supposed to be a benefit to those people who are of the Medicare age population, when in fact, those are the very people that are going to be most impacted due to the fact that the increased exposure to Medicare is what is going to precipitate a company saying, maybe not there. Let's go for a GLP-1 for someone with obesity who's 40 years old. Then we'll be out of the intellectual property by the time we get price controlled. That's the problem.
And it's a talking point I hear time and again when I'm meeting, and we meet with policymakers of all stripes, because we really are focused on education and awareness here, even for people who fundamentally disagree with the concept of venture capital and even the concept of capitalism, because there are a few out there these days. In those conversations, I think it has become very clear that there are disincentives at work here that are working against the fundamental goals that even proponents of the IRA were looking for, like you said. But they'll come to me and they say, well, I saw company X buy company Y. So clearly, things are still good out there. And then I ask them to peel it back a little further. I say, oh, it's for a disease that primarily impacts people in their 20s and 30s. Well, those aren't Medicare age people. So this drug's never going to be subject to price controls. So yes, we'll still get trifecta. We will still move the ball forward in cystic fibrosis. But if we need a whole new type of trifecta for the day those first generation of cystic fibrosis patients are making it past 65, that's completely disincentivized. And there are other reasons to move forward with an investment as well. For some drugs, 9 years will be enough. If manufacturing is going to be super easy, if payers are waiting on the door, if the patient population is totally matched, if all the stars align, sure, I'll still invest in some small molecule drugs. But all the stars have to align. And that's the problem here. We've kept Washington from putting its thumb on the scale of drug development for so long. And now its thumb is firmly on the scale, and it's going to pick winners and losers. And I think at Incubate, we'd rather let science make those decisions than policymakers in Washington.
And the problem is that everything going right, the stars aligning, that's still only going to happen in the best case scenario 8 to 10% of the time. So if you're an investor, you have to assume that 90% of the time you're going to be throwing everything right down the Swanee. every single time. You have to assume that. So you're discounting your return on investment by 90% at least in the very best case scenario. So the problem is if you're still then saying, okay, now I'm going to reduce this by 50% on top of that, why would you do that? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. And this is what's been called the pill penalty by many people. I had a podcast with Peter Kolchinsky, a member of your organization. And this pill penalty, it started to become a narrative around Washington, D.C., but these aren't just rhetorical. These are actual real impacts. How do you see the congressional folks that you're speaking to on behalf of your members? How is this going? Are they understanding the havoc that they've wreaked upon the sector? Are they starting to realize what's going on?
Yeah, so Incubate was the driving force behind the introduction of the EPIC Act, which would solve what we call the small molecule penalty, and someone cleverer than us dubbed the pill penalty alliteratively. The awareness is there. I will actually give a lot of credit to our team in Washington and to Democrats and Republicans alike who sat with us and we walked through the problem. And we were able to get a bipartisan bill introduced that would fix this by giving small molecules the same 13 years that biologics get. That would solve the problem that Peter laid out very well. And he's been a brilliant member of Incubate and really helped raise just the advocacy bar across venture capital. So the EPIC Act is the solution. Then we run into politics. And the reality was, this was the Inflation Reduction Act was President Biden's marquee landmark legislation. And while his verbiage about what it accomplished was at times inaccurate, there weren't going to be too many Democrats ready to leap on board. But we did get a dozen Democrats starting to talk about we need to explore this penalty. And I am confident that when this bill comes back up in the next Congress, that those Democrats will be standing right alongside Republicans saying, we've got to fix this because this penalty is the most pernicious. This is the worst unintended consequence. Alongside another one would be the orphan drug designation issue. And so I'm bullish. And I was bullish before this election. I'm bullish now. The data is so strong and so clear that money is moving away from small molecule drug development, that for Congress not to act on it and even leave the price control mechanisms in place, it would be one of the most devastating things to select patient populations you could imagine. And because of that, and because we brought the receipts, I think we're going to actually see the EPIC Act become law.
Now, you are saying that the data is conclusive. We are finding that the data is conclusive. We have a study that's about to drop that will show this. However, 11 months ago, 10 months ago, Director General Swagel of the CBO published a letter to the House Budget Committee that said, well, we see no evidence at all of any decline in venture capital funding of pharmaceuticals since the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. And of course, they used that all-powerful, wonderful, omnipotent database, Crunchbase, to make this assessment. And I'm being mildly sarcastic because Crunchbase is essentially a free platform that's not known for its huge accuracy in early-stage venture capital. Why did they get this so wrong?
I hate to give the answer I'm going to give because it's a bit of a cop-out, but I'll unpack it. But healthcare is complex, and that's why making changes here is very, very challenging. And I don't doubt the capabilities of the good folks at CBO, but you can't query one big database and feel like you have your pulse on anything in the venture capital community. And I think some of the data they were looking at also looked at raising funds versus deploying capital. It is hard for anyone to paint a picture that biotech has been this booming environment since the Inflation Reduction Act. That's just factually incorrect. But I think they got it wrong for two reasons. One is they live in a 10-year time horizon, and our drugs take 15 or 20 years to develop. So they almost have this cheat code that they don't have to really worry about what happens in year 11. But if you're a venture capitalist, even though your fund's going to turn over before that, you are looking at things more than 10 years down the road. And that's one of the biggest comments. The CBO is kind enough to invite several folks in to give feedback on what they're getting wrong. And that was one key piece of feedback is the 10-year time horizon doesn't work. I think some other just faulty assumptions about how the life cycle of large pharma and small biotech works. They thought this small biotech exemption, which I loudly claimed was going to be largely impotent, and I think that has been proven to at least in the first couple years. There was this cognitive dissonance that you can beat up the large pharmaceutical companies, but keep the small biotech innovative clusters fine, backed by venture capital. And it just showed how little they understood that those exits, the venture capital has to redeploy those funds, which means they have to exit their position in that small biotech. Well, who buys the small biotech? The large pharma does. And it seemed like CBO was, by completely siloing impacts of the other aspects of the IRA, Part D redesign. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars coming off the table. And then to say, well, how we won't lose R&D is because they separate the R&D that small biotechs do from the large pharma. And you just can't do that.
Yeah, no, that's 100% correct. We had a meeting with CBO, and the analogy I started using was, okay, Atlantic Records, 1971, Led Zeppelin funds John Coltrane. No Led Zeppelin, no John Coltrane. And then one of the gentlemen in the CBO, God bless him, I wish I wish I had video of this. He says, and no Monty Python. It's like, yes, you're right. Led Zeppelin funded Monty Python too. So no Led Zeppelin, no Monty Python, no John Coltrane. This is the problem. It's the film industry. A blockbuster funds a whole bunch of other stuff. And by attacking the blockbusters, you're attacking the ability of the other stuff to exist. It's all the funding flows that go down to the early stage development.
You're absolutely right. I use a thought experiment. A lot of times we'll go into progressive offices that I know are opposed to what we're talking about. And so I like to start with a thought experiment with the member and sort of say, do you think an 1,000% return on one product is problematic? And I say, yes, that is outrageous. That is exactly the bad behavior. We're the profit seeking that we are trying to end. And then I say, well, in what I invest in, what we invest in the life sciences community, 9 out of 10 of our investments go absolutely to zero. They are complete failures, no value. We lose all the money, which means for me, even to break even and 10 years later, hand back the folks who invested in my fund, just give their money back, let alone any profit that your retirement fund or pension fund might want. I have to make an 1,000% return on the one product just to get to break even 10 years later. And I think that illuminates why this concept that I think is more pervasive than just the pharmaceutical industry, this concept of beating up on winners, the big profit makers of products and companies, they pay for so many other things that you never see. And that's on us. Yeah, let me show you all the things that went wrong. But we get very scared in the public markets to do that. I do want to clarify one thing. That the CBO, to be fair to them, this is not from point A to point B. The Inflation Reduction Act gets passed. I shut down this program. Now, we do have examples of that where, Alnylam, Genentech, they were very clear. We would not be doing this but for the IRA. But what the tracker also tries to do is quantify, okay, maybe it tipped the scale.
Right.
Maybe Pfizer was closing that small molecule facility anyway, or maybe they were on the fence of closing it. And so it is hard to quantify in a dynamic economy what one factor drove someone to do something. And that probably ties CBO's hands a little bit because they want point A to point B. And that's just not how the real world works. And that's one of the reasons why CBO projections 10 years out are almost universally incorrect. And I don't fault them for that. but that dynamism is tough to quantify.
And the other challenge is that a lot of the data has a tendency to bias itself towards institutional investments, large investments, Bloomberg sources, things like that, where you're dealing with Wall Street investment banks. You mean large multi-billion-dollar deals or funding flows that are very, very large and are often far later than phase one or phase two, where the ventures and the angels are playing. That's the other problem. That's really hard to do.
And not to wander too much, but you just laid out a great point. FTC and M&A, Amgen Horizon still goes through. And what I get sometimes is proponents of Ms. Khan's viewpoint of the FTC, which seems to be coming to a close. Look, Horizon Amgen still happened. The FTC is still working. Yeah, Horizon Amgen still happened because it's a $20 billion deal, and that can carry a lot more regulatory and legal risk. It's the Sanofi maze. It's the deals we never even know. It's the $10 million company that makes no sense now, the $100 million acquisition that makes no sense now, but we'll never quantify that. We will never know the deals that never get done because they're too small for the regulatory risk. And that was my problem with the FTC. And so it's the confirmation bias that you laid out there of you can see what you want in the data is you can look, yes, there's still going to be pharmaceutical acquisitions, but that doesn't mean that this environment is as healthy or as efficient as it can be. And the person who pays at the end of that isn't the investment bank. It's not even the venture capitalist. It is a patient who at the end of the day isn't going to get a breakthrough medicine that could have been developed. And I have a problem with that.
Yeah. And essentially what you're looking at is we're biasing the research to the mature trees to make lumber. We're not looking at the front end where who's planting the seedlings. And what we're going to see is a heck of a lot fewer trees in particular areas. Small molecules for neurological disorders, dementia. I mean, we've seen a complete acing out, a zeroing out in small molecule research in dementia and Alzheimer's disease. It's just completely vanished. We're seeing other areas, hematology. We've seen a complete swing from 70, 80% small molecules to zero in 2024. Autoimmune, we've seen that in 2023, a complete move. And this is what we're seeing in the data. We're seeing enormous switches, people responding to the incentives on the early stage investment side, phase one and phase two, moving where areas we would expect to see enormous amounts of small molecules being 100% large molecules now.
And it's just there. Craig Garthwaite out of Northwestern is terrific at this and is an actual econ professor. Sometimes I play one on TV, but this all makes sense. If you have a portfolio of 100 products and get told that your rewards for swinging for the fences are going to get capped, what's the first thing you're going to do? You de-risk your portfolio of the crazy stuff, of platform technologies like mRNA and the really big breakthrough technologies that's going to take 20 years. And it's so funny. Me Too drugs, as people want to call them, do have a role in society. They create competition. They help different patient populations. I'm not anti second generation drugs and Me Too drugs. But the hill is, and one of the funny things, funny is probably the wrong word, they have incentivized more Me Too drugs because they have asked people to de-risk their portfolios. So now instead of a pediatric cancer product coming forward, we're going to get our 8th and 9th GLP-1s.
Yeah.
And that's where we put the incentive. So that's where the capital goes.
Going back to PitchBook and some of the data we've been looking at early stage, we saw, and PitchBook had an article about this last year, there was an overall general decline in the U.S. by 38% in early stage VC. Are you seeing among your membership, is this recovering or is it still down? Where are we?
We've got a survey out in the field that we look forward to presenting soon where we're trying to establish that. Anecdotally, I think some people are now ready to kick over some early stage rocks and see what's there. But the pressure to take big risk that has been so defining of venture capital certainly was taken off. So we are hopeful that in the newest set of data, we might see that. But what you're calling out is exactly right. People walked away from the most risky, whether it's a product, whether it's a time in the drug development pipeline. We've walked away from the riskiest stuff, and we're going to pay the price not tomorrow, not next year, not even the year after that. We've got plenty of FDA approvals coming. We're going to pay the price in 8 to 10 years, looking around saying, why is everything a biologic? So you've got to go to an infusion center. You got to go to a hospital. You got to go to a clinic. We've got nothing that I can go to my Walgreens and get better. And it is so painful to know. Many of us are going to sit around and say, I told you so, because that's not going to feel good. But that's why I'm bullish and optimistic we're going to fix this, because the damage is too real.
The problem is it's so hard to prove a counterfactual. It's so hard. You can't say, if you had a time machine and you could take everybody and say, see, you've lost 60% of your cancer drugs. Wow. How did this happen? Well, we can show you. The problem is we don't have that reality. It's very, very difficult to prove that now. I mean, we can jump up and down and pull our hair and threaten to eat worms, but the reality is people don't want to believe it, and that's why it's so challenging. You've mentioned that this can be fixed by getting both large molecules and small molecules to be negotiated at year 13. Are there any other fixes that should be put in the bill as far as you're concerned in the law?
For the small molecule penalty, no. I want to be very clear that that's a clean fix. Get rid of 9, get 13 in there. Because as you laid out, 50% of a drug's revenues come in those years. So it's a big deal. And Peter's spoken to this well. So that's the fix for the small molecule penalty. For the multiple indications, which is a separate issue, that is another one that I would say is a cousin to the small molecule penalty. The story of medicine is one of second indications and third indications, because what works in blood cancer works in pancreatic cancer, works in liver cancer. Why we would not fully explore those is crazy. And so I think we've got to fix that. I know there's some hope that CMS could give some guidance that one indication can be expanded across different designations and vice versa. I think it's probably going to take a law fix. And so maybe the Orphan Act gets forward with that. I think from the venture capital perspective, and a lot of this is changing. I mean, we'll see what the new Republican trifecta, whether they strip the whole drug pricing mechanism altogether. But those are the two that absolutely have to be done. A little bit above my pay grade and more further in the manufacturers. This biosimilars issue. I think we've screwed with incentives, and as we see those incentives play out, I think that will need to be addressed. Sometimes I keep it simple, stupid. Just cross out 9 and put in 13, and you will end the small molecule penalty. And that's what we're very focused on.
Obviously, the election just occurred. The Trump administration has pulled off the hat trick, the trifecta, as you mentioned. Let's not forget that as Trump was walking out the door under the last administration, one of the last things he did was sign Most Favored Nations, which would have been a Medicare Part B negotiation price where they would have taken a basket of countries and then taken the average Part B price for each drug. We saw 50 to 60% reductions across the board. In fact, our economic assessment is sitting with the court injunction that was filed by Bio against that legislation. Now, obviously, the Trump administration wasn't there to file an appeal against the injunction. That is still sitting there. What do you think happens when Trump takes over? What's going to happen?
Well, my hope is that for all of us, age gives us wisdom. And coming back 4 years later, I think there's some optimism that is a policy President Trump is ready to let go. I think he has some health advisors or has seen in recent years that I think he saw the failure of the Inflation Reduction Act to meaningfully change patients' lives with the drug pricing provisions. I am all for capping out-of-pocket costs. I'd like to see out-of-pocket costs gone and let insurance be insurance. But I think maybe President Trump will recognize that the juice isn't worth the squeeze here and will move on to other issues, because if his goal is to swing for the fences and to truly fix a broken healthcare payer system, reference pricing isn't the way to do it. It's going to get you a lot of pain. It's going to hurt our competitiveness around the world, as a lot of your studies have pointed out. I think he'll put pressure on the free riding rest of the world around innovation. You actually see countries beginning to pay attention to this. Japan in particular
Yes.
has figured out, the drug loss there, that 70% of new medicines aren't available. Japan is changing its behavior and is paying more for American-made pharmaceuticals. I think that is something we should see the Trump administration push for around the world instead of undercutting ourselves at home, which will just have the same dismal consequences. So my hope is that wisdom wins the day here, and that we move on, and I get to go 4 years not hearing the term most favored nation.
Again, the investment tracker is great. It's a receipts situation about how IRA is impacting the ecosystem. Can you give everybody the address so if they want to access it, they certainly can?
Absolutely. www.lifesciencetracker.com, and you can find more about Incubate at incubatecoalition.org.
John, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to seeing you the next time in D.C.
Anytime. Safe travels. Thanks, Dwayne.
Thank you, John. All the best. The executive producer of the Vital Health Podcast is Dwayne Schultes. Our editor is Mark Brodeen. Our project manager is Gwen O'Loughlin. The Vital Health Podcast is a production of Vital Transformation, LLC, copyright 2024.